I was declared legally dead on paper, which is a strange thing to learn about yourself while sitting in a hospital bed on the other side of the world, still very much alive. My name is Daniel Reyes, and 5 years ago I vanished from the record books, not because I ran from anything, but because I was buried under an operation I couldn't talk about. I'd been working a long-term undercover contract for a federal task force investigating a smuggling network that moved through 3 states, and when the operation went sideways, my handlers made the call to erase me. No calls home, no paper trail, not even my own mother knew if I was breathing. After 5 years of silence, a courtroom I never set foot in declared me legally deceased, because that's what happens when a person disappears completely and nobody can produce a body or a heartbeat. My family held a funeral for an empty casket, and 300 miles away, on 11 acres of land my grandfather left me in Colorado, a woman named Karen Ashcroft was already drawing blueprints. I need you to understand something about that land before I tell you what she did to it, because the land itself is the twist you won't see coming. My grandfather wasn't just a rancher. He was part Ute on his mother's side, and back in 1974, he'd negotiated something unusual with the county, a conservation and cultural preservation easement, filed quietly, barely noticed, that permanently restricted the land from residential development and granted a reversionary interest to the local tribal historical trust if that restriction was ever violated. It was his way of protecting a burial ground on the property that predated the county itself. He never made a fuss about it. He just filed the paperwork and let the land sit quiet for decades. When he passed, the property came to me, and I never got around to building anything on it. I liked it wild. I liked that nothing was there. When I was declared legally dead, the land technically became part of my estate, and because I had no spouse, in my will named a dormant trust with outdated instructions, a probate court appointed an estate administrator to liquidate what remained. That administrator, it turned out, golfed with Karen Ashcroft's husband. Within 8 months, my 11 acres were sold at a quiet estate auction to a shell company Karen controlled for a fraction of its worth, and by the time I resurfaced, there were 42 half-built homes standing where my grandfather's pasture used to be, along with a stone entrance sign that read Ashcroft Ridge Estates, a clubhouse under construction, and a homeowners association with Karen as its self-appointed president, already collecting dues from families who'd put their life savings into homes on land that was never supposed to hold a single nail. I found out I was dead the same week I found out my land was gone. And I'm not going to pretend that didn't break something in me for a few days. But if you've ever been underestimated by someone who thinks paperwork is the same thing as truth, you know that quiet fury is a different animal than rage. I didn't storm onto that property. I didn't scream in a homeowners meeting. I drove to the county archive first, because 5 years in an operation where one wrong word gets you killed teaches you that the only weapon that actually wins is the one nobody sees coming. I pulled my grandfather's original 1974 filing. I pulled the reversionary clause. I pulled the burial ground survey conducted by the State Archaeological Office in 1976, the one that had apparently been lost from the county's active records right around the time the estate sale went through. It hadn't been lost. It had been buried in a mislabeled folder, and I have a strong suspicion Karen's husband, a mid-level county clerk with access to zoning archives, knew exactly where that folder was and made sure it stayed unread. If you're new here, this is usually the part where I'd ask you to hit subscribe, but honestly, stay with me, because the next part is the reason people keep coming back to this channel, and I promise you it's not what you're expecting. I didn't go to Karen with a lawyer first. I went to the Tribal Historical Trust, quietly, and handed my grandfather's original filing along with the buried survey. Under the terms of that 1974 easement, any development on the protected acreage automatically triggered a full reversion of title to the trust. No court battle required, no negotiation. The land simply stopped being anyone's to sell the moment ground was broken on it, which meant every home Karen built, every foundation poured, every dollar spent on Ashcroft Ridge Estates had been constructed on land that legally reverted away from her the instant her construction crews touched the first burial marker boundary.
She hadn't just built on stolen land, she'd built on land that was never hers to begin with, sold to her through a probate fraud she didn't even know was fraud, using an appraisal that conveniently never mentioned an easement that had somehow vanished from public record right before her purchase.
The trust filed the reversion claim within a month, and because the clause was self-executing rather than something a judge had to rule on, there was nothing Karen's attorneys could do to stall it the way they could with an ordinary property dispute. Title didn't just get contested, it evaporated retroactively, back to the date construction began, which meant every mortgage those 42 families had taken out was suddenly secured against a title that legally didn't exist. Karen's shell company, the one she'd used to make the estate purchase look clean, was named directly in the fraud investigation once the county launched an audit into how a federally protected cultural easement disappeared from active zoning records for exactly the 11 months it took her to close the sale. Her husband lost his clerk position within 2 weeks and lost it publicly in a county board meeting that made the regional news. And here's the part that still doesn't feel real to me even now, because Karen had personally guaranteed the HOA's construction loans, using her own assets as collateral so she could avoid the interest rates the shell company would have carried on its own. The loan default triggered when the land reverted didn't stay contained to the neighborhood. It came straight for her. Her house, her savings, the lake cabin she and her husband had bought 2 years earlier with what I now believe were skimmed HOA reserve funds, something the fraud audit is still unraveling. The 42 families weren't villains in this story, and I want to be honest about that part, because it would be easy to let this become a story about crushing everyone in that neighborhood, and that was never the goal. Most of them didn't know. Most of them had been sold the same lie Karen had built her empire on. So when the reversion went through, the tribal trust, working with the county, negotiated a resettlement fund pulled directly from what could be recovered of what could be from Karen's frozen assets to help those families relocate and recover a portion of what they'd lost. It felt, for the first time in this entire nightmare, like something was actually being made right instead of just being punished.
Karen didn't get a fine and a slap on the wrist. She got named in a civil fraud suit, a federal cultural preservation violation, and a personal bankruptcy filing that stripped away the empire she built on a grave she never bothered to ask permission to build over. The clubhouse she was so proud of, the one with her name etched into the cornerstone, was the first structure demolished, at her own remaining expense, under a court order that specifically required removal of anything built within the historical boundary. I stood at the edge of that land on the day the demolition crew arrived, in the same spot where I used to sit with my grandfather as a kid, and I watched them tear down a monument to someone else's greed. I wasn't declared dead anymore by then. The court had reversed that the same week the land reverted, which felt almost too poetic to be real. If there's one thing I've learned from disappearing for 5 years and coming back to find my own name erased and my land stolen from under a dead man's signature, it's that some ground remembers who it belongs to, even when the paperwork lies. If this story kept you until the end, you already know why I keep telling these, and if you want to hear the one about what the archaeological team actually found when they finally excavated that boundary properly, let me know in the comments, because that discovery is a whole story on its own, and I promise you it's the reason I'll never sell this land. Not for any price, not to anyone, ever again.